And so with that as a background, I'd like to introduce Margaret Gong Hancock, who is the founder of the Exponential Center. She's been with the museum for 2 years and has a long history here in Silicon Valley, having spent over 20 years at Stanford, engaged in a whole series of programs associated with technology and society around the world. And she's going to be running the program and moderating the event tonight. So let me welcome Marguerite to the stage and join me in doing that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Well, good evening and welcome. I'd just like to add my welcome to Daniel's to have you here tonight for this special program. You know, it used to be the experience that people would look at China tech firms and think of them as copycats, but those days are long gone. And tonight, we have two of the pioneering venture capitalists to talk about what's behind the tectonic shifts in China tech and venture capital, and what are the drivers underneath that, and what are the implications. Now we have Alibaba and Tencent among the world's top 10 internet companies. We have business models that are coming from China back to Silicon Valley. And behind that are a lot of the venture capitalists who are bridging what's happening here in Silicon Valley as well as what's happening in China. So let me introduce tonight's speakers. Carmen Chang joined NEA in 2012 and serves as a chairman and head of Asia. She was just recently appointed as a general partner. Wonderful to have a new woman venture capital partner here in the Valley. She's led many seminal deals in China over the past 25 years, including transactions with Lenovo, Foxconn, Tencent, as well as IPOs with SMIC and Speadtrum, as well as China Netcom and others. She serves on a number of boards, including for Wobot, Tuya, Drive, SMIC. In addition to her role at NEA, she's also very active at Stanford. She's a fellow at the Rock Center for Corporate Governance and actively involved as an affiliate at CSAC, the Center for International Security and Cooperation. She's very involved in new media. Many may not know this, but she's also involved with film as an investor and co-producer. She holds a master's degree as well as a JD degree from Stanford. In addition, we'll be having Hans Tung. Hans is managing partner at GGV Capital. He's focusing very much on consumer, internet, e-commerce, IoT, investments across China and the US. He counts 11 unicorns in his portfolio today, including not only companies in China like Meili, but also Slack, Airbnb, and perhaps very well known for his involvement with Xiaomi. He's been ranked by the Forbes Midas List as one of the top venture capitalists 6 times, and including being ranked number 20 this year. So please join me in giving a very warm CHM welcome to Carmen and Hans. Great to have you here, Hans. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Carmen, welcome to the stage here.
Thank you.
Well, let's jump in. It's such a delight to have both of you here. Thank you for joining us here at the Computer History Museum. It's such a pleasure to have two well-regarded venture capitalists who really focus not only on what's happening here, but spanning the Pacific with the Valley and China. I'd like to start with your giving our audience a sense of how you came to be a venture capitalist and go back to your education and kind of the major chapters in your careers. Both of you share a common beginning at Stanford, but in different departments.
Yeah.
But you've had a journey that's led you to be a venture capitalist in different ways. So Carmen, I'd like to start with you. You came in, I think, modern history, and then served as a leading lawyer here in the Valley, and then became a venture capitalist. So tell us about kind of your major chapters, and if there's kind of a thread that ties together your journey to becoming a venture capitalist.
Okay, well, I was born in China, but I grew up in Taiwan. And I came to the US to go to college, and I studied the arts in college. I wanted to be a dancer, a filmmaker. I worked with Joseph Papp, and I actually made a documentary film that was shown at Cannes. Our whole class did. So I was very interested in the arts, but I was always interested in history, in particular Chinese history, but also European history. And so after college, I went to graduate school to get my PhD in modern Chinese history. And I studied Chinese intellectual history, in particular the history of the development of the Chinese Communist Party's ideology and how it had a battle with the KMT, the nationalist ideology in the 1920s in China, which the 1920s are the years in which there was a united front between the CCP and the KMT. And at the end of that time, what people generally agreed with is that most of the major intellectuals in China were won over to the communists, which laid the basis for the subsequent war between the CCP and the KMT, which the KMT lost. But I mean, we can talk some other time because I feel the KMT really learned a lot of lessons from that and applied it to the development of Taiwan. So as I grew up in Taiwan, a lot of the lessons that they learned really helped Taiwan today actually have it's a democratic society, and it has made a lot of contributions to technology and other things as well. So
how does, with this intense academic interest, how did you become a lawyer at Wilson Sonsini?
I was told that I tried to get a job. I was looking for a tenure track position in modern Chinese history. And back then, it would be impossible. The only two jobs opening, one was in Kansas and one was in Massachusetts. And I was married and I really couldn't leave the area. So I thought I would study law because I could teach law, Chinese law, and there's just a lot more law schools that I could teach in. So I went to law school. And after law school, I thought, everybody says that you should practice law for a year or two, which I did. And I was looking for a law firm. Silicon Valley is a very small place. Now, I had been friends with David Drummond, before college. We were just friends. And he was at Wilson Sonsini. And he recruited me to Wilson Sonsini. And we worked together. And we were on the same team for Google, too. But of course, he left and became the general counsel and on to greater things. So I went to law school, and then I went to Wilson, thinking I was only going to be there for a year or two. But we can talk about this later too. But so many things were happening then, and I was pretty much the only fully bilingual corporate lawyer that had a background in Chinese history and a background in understanding Chinese institutions. So when I was a lawyer, and I'm from Taiwan too, so I naturally became the lawyer for TSMC, UMC, and then also I also represented Goldman Sachs in its first investment into a Chinese state-owned enterprise, because I was one of the few people that actually was a US corporate lawyer that understood how China operates, what is a state-owned enterprise, the role of the party. And so I became involved in a lot of things, and the years passed, one year after the other, and I became a lawyer. And I was a lawyer for like 2 decades, over 2 decades. And
we'll have a chance to talk about some of those seminal deals.
Yes.
After you decided to end your time being a lawyer, what convinced you to become a VC?
I was a lawyer for Scott Sandell of NEA, and we were always good friends. And he said, "Oh, just come and be my advisor." And so I said, "Okay." I mean, I knew Hans and Jenny and all these people too, right. And everybody thought I was going to go make films or have fun or whatever. And then I went to NEA, and Scott became the head of NEA. He was the head of NEA China.
Right.
And then he became the head of NEA. And he said, well, can you help me, with China for a while, And one thing led to the other. And I think, I guess I became a venture capitalist. I mean, Hans, you remember when I said, oh, I'm not a venture capitalist, I'm not an investor, I'm not doing
You're doing great.
No, so remember, I would preface that, right? Every time we're together. And at a certain point, actually, somebody said, Carmen, if you could just stop prefacing everything you say by saying, I don't really understand this, or I don't, but NEA, I have to say that, just to give a plug to my firm, but I really sincerely mean it, and I wouldn't plug it if it wasn't true, but I think that it's a wonderful place, and it really supported, they had people teach me about technology, explain to, of course, being at Wilson and representing a lot of technology companies and writing a lot of prospectus, I know about it. But, but people went out of their way to make sure I understood technology, that understand all the ins and outs of investment. And they were the first to tell me that, the things that you don't consider as a real investor, things like understanding people, being able to judge and measure people, and being able to have the trust of people, and to be able to really mentor young people.
Yes.
And all of that is important. So I became a venture capitalist, and I was able as a venture capitalist to do all the things I'm interested in, including investing in media content. So today, for example, I invested in, and I'm on the board of a Hollywood studio called STX, which are a bunch of people from Universal that formed it, and it has works closely with Huayi Brothers, which is China's biggest non-state film company, as well as Tencent. So in a certain kind of way, everything came together, and I'm able to be involved in issues relating to the transfer of technology to what I've always been interested in, which has been the arts, and I'm able to do that now, and to really nurture young production companies developing in China that's making short videos as well as films. So that's kind of where I am today.
Thank you for sharing that journey. It's been, as you say, one thing led to another. Now, Hans, your journey has been quite different. It also has a Stanford element, Taiwan element, but tell us about the evolution to becoming a banking and venture that's brought you to China and back again.
So my parents went to China. They were born in China as well, and they went to Taiwan with the KMT party in 1940s. So growing up in Taiwan, I thought myself more as Chinese rather than just Taiwanese, because there's a identity thing in Taiwan. For those of us that have ancestors that came from China, we were called Waishenren, people from the other provinces. And so I remember in the right when I finished middle school, finishing elementary school, my father told me that we're moving to U.S. Because my older sister had already gone to U.S., went to Cornell, MIT, and worked on Wall Street, and then did interesting things. That my parents want me and my younger brother to have the same thing. So I said something that was very interesting to my father. I said, if everybody left Taiwan to go to the United States, who's going to defend Taiwan when the communists come? So for someone who really growing up believed that Taiwan should be unified, a very strong nationalist, I came to the U.S., did my middle school and the high school in Los Angeles, and then came to Stanford for my 4 years undergrad. I think Stanford really changed me. It's everything about innovation, about creativity, about how the Western civilization went through Renaissance period, scientific revolution, and everything that came afterwards, modernization. What does it mean to be modern? That had a great 4 years. Even though I studied industrial engineering, my heart was in modern thoughts, literature, and history. So with that as a background, after Stanford, I worked on Wall Street at Merrill Lynch Investment Banking in M&A. And then for my third year, I figured, hey, why not spend a year in Hong Kong and see what's going on? That was 1995. And that was the year that a lot of Chinese SOE, state-owned enterprise, were going to New York Stock Exchange to get IPO'd. And I worked on a few of those deals and went to Shenzhen for the first time in 95. And I look around and go, oh my God, this place is really backward. This country is going to take a while before they modernize us. And then, just like Carmen, TSMC, UMC, all the IC semiconductor fabrication companies in Taiwan were going out to raise funds. So you can tell that Taiwan has moved from PC to semiconductors, and it's very good at doing outsourcing, and it's leveraging the growth in US and Europe to fuel its own technology growth. And you start to see how the Taiwanese model kind of learned after Japan and Korea, but with its own differences, focused a lot more SMBs. So it was just fascinating for someone like Carmen, who is a sort of student in history, just to see how the whole East Asian countries, including Hong Kong and Singapore, all develop. And after 3 years in investment banking, I thought I would just go back to the US, go to business school. And then was contacted by another large PE firm to start an operation in China. It was Warburg Pincus. I turned that down to join a Taiwanese family that was building its own fund with different families from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and different countries in Southeast Asia. I thought it would be good for someone who had no background in anything about how Asian business work to be on the inside and see how these families operate. So I did that for 3 years in Taiwan and Singapore, had a great time and learned a lot. And then the internet sector boomed. I remember before I started working for this family, I see this in 95, 96, this news report of this company called Netscape went public with a lot of losses and not much revenue, and the valuation was gigantic. And then a few months later, Microsoft came out with IE to try to compete against Netscape. So I thought it was interesting, and I figured that just like blockchain's hot today, I thought, hey, as somebody who's only 25 years old, I should do something internet-related just to learn. So I did a startup for 3 years with money from Greylock and HQ Asia. I was part of a funding team that did that. And 4 years later, we ended up selling that company, and I came back to the US. And now, having done investment banking, growth capital, and then startup, I knew that being a VC was what interested me the most. I didn't want to be stuck in a bank running deals after deals after deals. Even though it's a great profession, it's just not something that interests me. I was fascinated by how these industry and sectors evolve, and just like how in history, all these different empires compete against each other. So that kind of logic was something that fascinated me. Technology seems to be like the game changer that makes things work and very different, that young people and more people around the world have access to something that's just not possible before. And to me, is the continuation of everything that we saw in the Renaissance all the way up to now. Just everything gets democratized more and more and more. And having technology, everything grows at a faster pace. You need to watch out for the impact of technology. So I thought doing something that's VC related was a continuation of that academic interest. At the same time, it was fascinating to see how the different countries compete and collaborate against one another. So ends up deciding that VC was the best thing I should be doing. And when I first met you, Marguerite, I was in Stanford looking for an academic major. And then 10 years later, when we met again, I was looking to get into the VC field and was hired by Bessemer to go to China. And then in another 10 years, when we obviously we see each other in the process, but another 10 years later.
We only see each other once every 10 years. Not really.
I've been already doing VC in China for almost 8-9 years. And I think I was very fortunate, just like Carmen, start working on projects at Watson Sassini, because no one else can speak Chinese. No one else understood China to do stuff that's China or Taiwan related. In 2005, when I decided to do VC, I knew that at some point US VC would look at what's happening in China and making adjustments. So if I could join a US VC to go to China, that was probably the best way to understand how VC business work, and as well as make impact in China. So when I moved to China in 2005 with Bessemer, it was about a year, with the 12 months before that happened, I remember Tencent went public in Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Valuation was about $1 billion. That was 2003. And what's the valuation of Tencent today? Does anyone in the audience know? 500 billion. That's right, 500 billion. So in a span of 14 years, we went from 1 billion to 500 billion as a publicly traded company. Then after Tencent went public, Speadtrum went public. Speadtrum, number one, the sort of Expedia or Priceline of China, went public in 2003. And the market cap, does anyone remember the market cap of Speadtrum in 2003?
With James Young. We
James Young,
were with James.
Another Stanford grad, PhD from Stanford. $260 million. And what's the market cap of Speadtrum today? 25 to 30 billion. From 260 million in 2003 to now, 14 years later, 25 to 30 billion dollars market cap, and this is a real growth. This is real money. This is not stuff you fake and with a lot of losses. These are real companies. And then Shenda went public a few months later as a #1 gaming company in China, and then after I joined Bessemer and started going to China, a few months later, Baidu went public, and Baidu popped the first day. The stock price went up quadruple, and ended around that day at about $5 billion valuation. And I remember everyone in the Valley said China is overheated. Because in 2004, a year before they went public, I remember this, Baidu only had $11 million of revenue. And how could a company that only had $11 million of revenue be worth $5 billion? Clearly, there's a bubble here. Everybody in Silicon Valley has seen what 1999 and 2000 looked like. This is going to burst. And what's the valuation of Baidu today? Even despite all the issues, it's still $60 billion. So there's something going on in China that was not just a bubble. There was something else that was happening where technology, internet was transforming that society. I think we were just very fortunate to be on the ground, seeing that happen and participate and help to make that happen.
Well, as you can see, these two really have had an unusual and we might say a unique combination of background and experiences and skills to place them in a place to not only be seeing, but actually leading some of the very early changes, the tectonic shifts in China. I'd like to bring up a little bit of data here to show some of the world's largest companies by market cap. Yeah. And we can see that this is 2008, and then now fast forward to 2018. And as we look at this, some might say that data has replaced oil and credit as the most valuable commodity. And of course, it's also notable to see here that we can see venture-backed internet companies that are now among these top 10. I'd like to ask both of you to help place us, to give a kind of then and now perspective, because you were helping drive this. Carmen, I want to take us back even a little bit earlier, because you were structuring some of these very earliest deals in the 1980s. That were really defining the structure, the organization for state-owned enterprises, how U.S. companies were going in, into China with Google, how Goldman Sachs. What were you seeing in those very early days? If you could tell us about one of those early deals, who were you working with? What was the context? What were some of the early challenges and opportunities that you saw in the 1980s?
Well, it's kind of what I find interesting is how some of those issues are coming back today. But I think, back at the very beginning in the mid-90s, as you were saying, I mean, you saw a lot of the first investments into China was from the Chinese diaspora, from people from Taiwan and places like that. And that was both here in the Valley as well as in China. And the role of TSMC and those Taiwan companies, were immense. And I would say there were a couple of things that were interesting at that time. One is, I incorporated Foxconn, and I was there when we tried to structure a deal that would make Michael Dell comfortable and the U.S. government comfortable that the technology would not be stolen in China. So we were able to craft a whole system so that Dell computers was manufactured in a Foxconn factory in Shenzhen. And we were able to work out all the different kinds of technology and who can go where and how to handle it. So that's something that I found myself recently having to deal with. And I also think that the first beginnings of Goldman investing in China Netcom and how to invest in a Chinese state-owned enterprise and what that means. And also back then, around that time, the time that you're talking about too, there was also the beginning of these great internet companies. But there was kind of like I would say that you had the semiconductors, you had technology companies developing in China, like SMIC. And at the same time, you had these internet companies. And you had, and I represented Google in our investment in Baidu. And I spent 3 years trying to convince Baidu to sell to Google. And Baidu was never willing to. I spent a lot of time trying to do that and wasn't interested. And also, I think and then a lot of the structures that developed at that time, like the VIE and all of that were developed at that time by lawyers, of course. And I think that the thing that I found that was really fascinating in that early time is you had a lot of entrepreneurs in the Chinese community from Taiwan and places in Taiwan. And then you had the beginnings of engineers and people that came to the US from China. And so in the mid-90s, you had the formation of UT Starcom, and a company that Marguerite was involved with as well. Now, that company was brought together by Masayoshi Son. Now, Masayoshi Son was at Berkeley with the CEO of UT Starcom. They actually worked in the Berkeley ice cream shop together, selling ice cream. And they were, and then Masa, set up his own software company and all that. And then he pulled together he knew two teams. This team surrounding Hong Lu, who was from Taiwan, and a team around Ying Wu, who was from mainland China. And they together formed a company that Masa funded that became the first company that based in the US, but with extensive operations in China. And it's the first company in which you had huge amount of stock that went out to everybody. And I remember when UT Starcom went public that one of the receptionists in Hangzhou was able to buy a condominium. From the results. It was a very, very exciting time. And I think that that whole middle period was a period, you saw the banks, Morgan Stanley formed a joint venture with CICC, which resulted in probably China's biggest investment bank today. You saw the beginnings of, just the beginnings of US investors. I would say the early stage, you saw a lot more US investors going to China directly. Flying to China to invest. And so you had this whole period. And I think that you saw this, it was a period where a lot of the issues, of the structure, how you deal with IP transfer, how you deal with the capital markets, and how you deal with these issues, were already percolating then. And I think there was a middle period where a lot of those things were resolved, or there were solutions found that gave people a period of incredible growth and development. And today, I see a lot of the same issues coming back in a different form.
Building on that, thank you, Carmen, is this phenomenal rise of, as you've talked about, Hans, this rise of the middle class and this democratization of internet bringing new companies, a whole wave of new entrepreneurs and new investment. Can you tell us a little bit about one of your deals that was on the very early side of consumer internet for China? Introduce us again to the players, what you saw as the opportunity in those early days, and what were some of those early issues that you were trying to resolve?
Right. I think between mid-90s to early or mid-2000s, that was a period where there were a lot more money going to semiconductors or telecom equipment, because China was in the sort of country building phase. You got to lay out ADSL, you got to lay out infrastructure in order to bring internet access available in that country. So the Cisco, the Nortels, the Huaweis, the ZTEs of the world all grew a lot in China as a result of that. And then with the between 2003 and 2005, you start seeing internet companies listing on NASDAQ, and they're to make U.S. investors understand what these companies were doing. They were always called the X of China. So Baidu was called the Google of China. Ctrip was called the Expedia of China, and then Tencent was called AOL of China, and then Alibaba was called the eBay of China. So it was a period where you see a lot of copying from what's going on in Silicon Valley into China, but the Chinese entrepreneurs were very smart in figuring out how to localize it to fit the condition in China. And as an investor, a lot of people ask us, when you look at investment, how do you decide to invest or not? How do you know the valuation is expensive or not? The real answer is when we invest, it has very little to do with valuation. It has everything to do with what's the trend you're capturing. And the trend that was driving the growth in Chinese internet companies is that offline world in China was extremely efficient. There are 30 plus provinces. Everybody have different rules. China Mobile is now one entity. China Mobile is made up of 30 some different China Mobiles. Each province runs its own P&L. So if you want to expand offline to meet the demand of the rising middle class that was growing through the export-led economy or infrastructure build-up economy, you can't do that very quickly. But if you build an internet business, as internet penetration expands, PC penetration expands, and later on smartphone penetration expands, it's much easier to scale business over the internet than province by province, city by city, town by town. And so it wasn't obvious in 2005, 2004 back at that point, but all the money that went into the other aspects of the economy didn't grow as fast as money in companies that were doing internet, because it was the quickest way to scale. And GGV, fortunately, was an investor early in Alibaba in 2003. We bought shares from a very smart bank called Goldman Sachs that had one of the largest internet portfolios in China from 1998 to 2003. And by 2003, they want to sell because they've been in the market for a while. There was not much liquidity, so they were getting rid of a lot of investments in that space. And GGV was fortunate to pick up Alibaba. And the valuation on Alibaba in 2003, as some audience know, was like $180 million. It was super expensive back then because the company was still just about to break even, and revenue was growing, but it wasn't that big. And they just launched this thing called Taobao with $80 million raised from SoftBank that's going to be burning a lot of money soon thereafter. And
so Hans, can you give a little bit of context about what was Jack, what was Jack thinking in those early days? Because they were still kind of, as a Chinese saying goes, crossing the river by feeling the stones. Right. It was evolving what the business model was going to be. How were they going to monetize this? When you talk about Alibaba in those days and Taobao.
Sure. Yeah, EachNet was invested by eBay, then acquired by eBay later. And eBay had this saying 2005, 2006, they're going to crush Alibaba because eBay, everything on the transaction is guaranteed in the sense that there's a 50% transaction fee, so that the seller and buyer know that there's money at stake, and so that they will treat the transaction more seriously. Jack thought differently. Jack thought that if you charge people 50% to buy or sell goods, it's not something that people want to do because they want to find a better deal. So he made sure that the transaction was free. Now, how can you build business out of free? So what he thought about was that if he can get all the sellers not charging them anything to come to the platform and sell, over time he'll have volume. When there's volume, the sellers, in order to differentiate themselves from one another, will be willing to pay advertising dollars to gain better placement. So he can make money from advertising, but make nothing from transactions. And if you make money from advertising, it's based on the efficacy of how well you do. So you can calculate and see if the ROI makes sense as a seller to do that. And by having everything free, he got more sellers than anyone else. But how do you make sure the safety of the buyer is guaranteed? So that's why he came up with Alipay. So Alipay functions as an escrow service. So if I'm selling something to Carmen, Carmen has no idea who I am. Her money is parked not to my account, or not through credit card, not through anything, but money is put in Alipay. Once money is in Alipay, in 7 days, she'll get goods from me. If she doesn't like the goods she sees, she can cancel it. She can complain to Alipay, hey, there was a counterfeit. This thing was broken. This one's not real. Then the money stays with her Alipay account. So Alipay can always transfer that money to my Alipay account if the transaction was done correctly. So having that escrow service worked magically. There was no credit card in China. There was some debit cards, but people weren't sure about what they want to transact online. But having Alipay and Alipay tied to a debit card tied to a bank account, it was safe because they don't have to put all that money in Alipay. You can put a limited amount of money just for transaction to work. And there's a function as an escrow service that made it easier for Carmen to trust me. So that change made all the difference in the world. And Alibaba and Taobao grew from nothing in 2003 to now today about $1 trillion gets transacted on Taobao on any given year. And that kind of growth can only happen if you're solving a real world problem and shifting a lot of offline spending to online and grow the pie bigger. So if the valuation of Alibaba is 180 million in 2003 or 200 million or 400 million, it didn't really matter. It only mattered if a seismic shift happened and a lot of new growth take place as a result. And that's how you make money.
Behind the scenes of any company that's had this meteoric growth, there's a leader, somebody who's had a vision. Can you introduce us? You've both had a chance to work very closely with some of the real entrepreneurs who have led whole industry disruptions in China. Can you think of one founder that you've worked with that you would like to showcase? Who was it? What problem were they solving? And what kind of attributes do you see of them as they were kind of leading as an entrepreneur? Carmen?
Well, certainly people like Jack Ma, Pony, they're all, I mean, I think there's been a lot of things written about Jack and Pony. I mean, maybe I'll talk about Terry Guo.
Okay, take
sure.
about Terry, great.
I admire him so much. He
Of Foxconn, Terry Guo.
He's
Foxconn.
Terry Guo, the founder of Foxconn. And what I find I admire him a lot because he came up with this whole idea of Foxconn, himself.
Yep.
And it was his idea. And he went and he would just stay in Texas, deal for Michael Dell.
Yep.
And I remember when he was going to go after Apple. And I remember the week when he went over to Apple. And that partnership between him and Apple has lasted. And the thing about him that's always struck me first is that he came from a very difficult situation in his family. I mean, his father had been arrested in Taiwan for being pro-communist.
Right.
And he supported his mother from selling his father's old clothes on the streets of Taipei.
Yep.
He's brilliant. And so he built this company, and he took risks. He works morning, noon, and night. He is completely meticulous about details, and his word is gold. If he says something that he's going to do, he's going to do it. And he's somebody with heart and passion and a vision. And I saw him, put that vision into place. And I saw him build those factories in China. And I saw him navigating very complicated political situations.
Yep.
And I remember at a meeting he had with the mayor of Shenzhen or something, when the mayor said, well, you're from Taiwan. And he pounded the table and said, oh, you don't think I'm Chinese? So the mayor just, oh, no, you're Chinese. But, but today, for example, he is, well, I don't know how people feel about that. There's probably different points of view, but he is spearheading bringing technology and the most advanced technology and manufacturing, including to the United States.
Yeah, to Wisconsin.
This plant is going to be open next week in Wisconsin to build big screen video. And he's doing that. Well, one of the companies that I'm working on building is a company with Andrew Ng, who was a professor at Stanford, was in Google Brain and at Baidu, and who's one of the foremost, AI people in the world. And he and Terry is building a new company to bring artificial intelligence and machine learning to revolutionize manufacturing.
Right.
And Wisconsin is going to be one of the places that will see the most advanced technology being built. So I guess he's kind of I think he's an amazing person.
Yeah.
Thank you for introducing this view of Terry. Hans, who among the people that you've worked with would you like to tell us their story?
I know Carmen probably gets this question a lot as well. In San Francisco or New York or LA, I get a lot of question around, if there's no government protection, can the Chinese the company withstood entry from the Google, the Facebook, the Airbnb, and the Uber of the world? And kind of like Terry in the previous generation, we look at Jack Ma, you look at Alibaba, you look at Pony of Tencent. All of them are born around 1964, and by now they're in their early 50s, mid 50s, and the generation that came after them, the ones that are born in 70s and early 80s. The ones that are running Didi today, the ones running Toutiao, ByteDance, that's running Meituan, Wangxing, all of them in their mid to late 30s. If I look at these two generations of entrepreneurs, both of them are obviously younger than Terry, go at Foxconn. These three generations of entrepreneurs, what's common among them is that they all work 996 minimum. 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. And many of them, most of them work 007. They don't really sleep. And the amount of drive and desire they have, not just to accumulate wealth and do well, but somehow build a business that can change society and change history, that sense of mission, the sense of something beyond themselves to do something more is what's really interesting to me. In Silicon Valley, great entrepreneurs want to solve a problem, a pain point. They also have a mission to make the world better. But because China and Taiwan were more developing countries, there's another added thing about, I want to show you I'm as good as you. I want to show you that I can be the equal as you. And that drive was probably the biggest difference between a Chinese entrepreneur and an American entrepreneur. An American entrepreneur doesn't have that burden. It's just like, I want to build something that everyone in the world can use. That's it, full stop. And there's no emotional baggage involved. And the Chinese entrepreneur want to say, well, I want to show you I can be as big as you. And that drive motivates them to work almost all the time. So there's no work-life balance. It's just very much work-life integration. And when I was working in China between 2005 and 2013, I feel their energy and passion every single day. I can have meetings until midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. There's still people waiting to meet because their desire to do more is just so prevalent. And so, sure, Google has superior technology. Sure, Amazon's an amazing company. Sure, Uber revolutionized ride sharing. All that innovation, so-called innovation, did happen in Silicon Valley for sure. But China now has 4.7 million STEM graduates every year. And the country has produced as many unicorns as US now. And the amount of funding in China is the same, if not bigger than US domestically. So it really makes sense for more people in the Valley and outside in New York and other places to try to understand and learn China, because it is going to be a country and there's companies coming out. It makes sense to understand it and figure out ways to collaborate. And there are definitely ways to collaborate. From where Carmen sits and where I sit, we definitely see a lot of points of collaboration. But if you don't understand someone, it's very difficult to collaborate with them.
Thank you for that. That's a really important call, I think, for deeper understanding and to go beyond these kind of cardboard comparisons of this is the copycat of this, or to understand really this evolution of companies over time and the different ways of entrepreneurs. One deal that's in the news these days is the coming IPO of Xiaomi, and I'd like it because it's now probably on track to be one of the biggest deals, really. It's certainly of this year, and $100 billion or something like that for valuation. Can you just tell us a little bit about your early look at Leijun, and what did you see? You once described them as, what was it, only three guys and a crazy idea, and what's behind what he's building there? Is it a real company? What's behind the Mi phones? And what's the perspective for us to understand what's happening with Xiaomi?
I think Leijun started getting into the internet business, to technology business, back in 1992, 1993. He's about a year older than me. So I think he's going to be 49 this year. And when he was doing his first startup as employee number 6, the company is called Kingsoft. And in Kingsoft, because in the early days, in the 90s, you want to raise money to grow, the angel investor owned 85% of the company. Great guy, but back then, you have money, you have a big chunk of equity. And his Leijun CEO at Kingsoft had like 5%. So there wasn't really much to share with everyone else who helped to build the company. But he was very loyal. He stayed with the company for 17 years, took the company public as the CEO. He was the CEO for the last 10 years of Kingsoft. And he took the company in 2007. And the market cap of Kingsoft was $400 million. And 2007, Alibaba was already worth more than $5 billion. Jerry Yang just invested in it 2 years earlier. Tencent was already $4 billion. So everyone was 10x or bigger than him. And he started in the business before they did. So you can tell, he's like, what am I doing wrong? I work just as hard, if not harder. I'm just as smart, if not smarter. What am I doing differently? And he started figuring out that he was missing out on the key trends. So for going forward, the 3 trends he was focusing on was social networking, mobile, and then e-commerce. And so 3 years later, after he worked as an angel investor for 3 years, investing in company in these 3 areas, he decided he was going to do Xiaomi. And in hindsight, it was obvious because mobile was the biggest thing there is, smartphone was the biggest thing there is. And if US has Apple, South Korea has Samsung, Taiwan has HTC, and you have Foxconn building phones for everyone else, including them, who's going to be that equivalent in China? And he spent 3 years as an angel investor, keep on playing with every single Samsung phone and iPhone and HTC phone, and understanding what's wrong, what's good about each of the phones. He understood that these consumers that bought these phones have no voice on how the product will be spec'd. So he thought if he can build a company that's the smartphone, he will make sure that he can do crowdsourcing, having all his customers give him input. And he was willing to upgrade the operating system, which is Android-based, regularly. It ends up being once a week. It still does that today. And so if you can upgrade the OS every week, the super fans, the ones who are geek, are be willing to tell him what's wrong with his software and make it better. So he thought if you can build a company that's not different from Apple, that listens to consumers, he may have a chance to build something differentiated. So it was that idea of he want to do something different that's internet driven instead of hardware driven that attracted me to bet on him. But why him? Why not other people who have similar idea? The reason he can do what he did is that I thought there would be 5 key success factors to determine if the team can do this. Because in the history of smartphone, no startup have ever made it work. Everyone else has something else and they expect into it. Whether it's Nokia, Motorola, Ericsson, they're always doing something else and expand into the space. So was HTC, so was Samsung. So to do that from scratch in a cutthroat, razor-thin margin business, it's just something I've never done before. But if somebody has a chance of doing it, you'll need 5 things: hardware experience, software experience, know how to sell online, because selling offline is too inefficient, and be able to build a brand, and then be able to monetize, because hardware is going to be very cheap. You got to be able to monetize through internet services. So of those 5 characteristics, Beijing had 4. At Kingsoft, he built software that competed against Microsoft early on. He then was building games that compete against Shendot and NetEase, so he knew how games could be monetized for internet services. He built Joyo, which was sold to Amazon, became Amazon China, so he knew how to build an e-commerce business. And then I was co-investor with him in a company called Vanco that was selling clothes online and built a brand around it. The only thing he didn't have was hardware experience. But he had about 1 million fans on Weibo, which is China's version of Twitter in the early days, and he figured that he can recruit someone to do hardware. So out of 5 characteristics, he had 4, so we decided after a lot of internal debate to still bet on him.
Well, congratulations on being one of the very early people to make the bet and work with him, and we'll look forward to seeing how the IPO goes. I'd like to fast forward now and look at where you're both very active investing in China now. And Carmen, can you talk about what you're betting on now, and what do you see as the really interesting kind of trends that are driving what you're investing in?
Both in the US and in China, we believe that a lot of the major technological developments in the last period of time, in terms of mobility, in terms of the storage, a lot of these things have, and of course, artificial intelligence, have created a situation where we will see opportunities to invest and disruption across sectors. I mean, clearly in consumer internet, there's going to be development, but we also believe in traditional industries, in enterprise, in deep technology. There will be incredible opportunities to invest. So this is an incredible time. So in China, we've been approaching the investments in China. We've been looking at it from the point of view of course, we all recognize the incredible vitality of the consumer internet sector in China. So, we've invested in Toutiao. Yep. We're in ed tech companies, and we're in these different consumer internet companies. At the same time, we're also putting some emphasis in these areas. Healthcare. Yep. We're trying to do a lot of investments in healthcare, both in terms of pharmaceuticals. We in the US have a lot of great pharmaceutical companies with a lot of great compounds and drugs, and we intend to bring that to China, and we intend to work with people in China, and we think that is a source of growth and a source of investment. We also think that healthcare services. We had invested in traditional Chinese medicine clinics because we knew that the Chinese government would want to go in that direction. And so we do healthcare services and med tech. At the same time, we're also going into logistics and into, for example, we invested in a company that is a marketplace for agricultural fertilizers, which is actually doing very well. And of course, we're betting big in the artificial intelligence area. So as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to build a company that will bring artificial intelligence to and machine learning and robotics to manufacturing with different partners. And we also see that there's going to be a lot, the beginnings of enterprise in China. And so we've been working a lot with, and companies like Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba really recognize the importance of moving into that sector, into the cloud, into enterprise. And we've been able to work together with them to look at and invest in that. And then finally, I think I've been looking a lot at media content, AR, VR, because I think that media content is something that, because especially with 5G coming, with all the new technological advances, is going to really be, there will be very disruptive changes. But at the end of the day, having good content is critical. So that's why we're working with, we have companies here in the US that has technology that enables animation to be done more quickly and more cheaply. But we're investing in companies in China that is doing animation. And we're investing in video platforms, but also in production companies of young people trying to create not just films and television, but also short videos. So I think that NEA, just like we do in the US, try to invest across a broad sector, both for early stage as well as late stage.
Thank you. Hans?
Yeah, I think the NEA has done an amazing job in healthcare practice. That's something that it's an area we haven't done as much, and we'll end up doing more stuff in digital health. But beyond that, in terms of the IT area that both firms invest in, there's a lot of similarity. The three buckets that we look at: one's consumer, obviously, and we've been very successful in doing that. The second is enterprise. Now we have a lot of enterprise investment in the US. We see China start to come up. We're trying to figure out how we can leverage our experience in enterprise in the US to help the Chinese enterprise companies grow. And the third bucket is what we call frontier tech, which Carmen mentioned as well. AI, machine learning, autonomous driving, drones, AR, VR, all fall into that bucket. And we have a couple deals that the two firms collaborate on. So both in the US and China, we are looking at these three areas, and we're multi-stage. We can invest anywhere between seed to pre-IPO, which NEA has that flexibility as well. So if you've been around for a while, and GDV has been around for 18 years, the track record is good enough to give us the flexibility to be able to invest multi-stage but sector focus. And what we're seeing is that the experience that we saw in China as well as in the US is helping us to even make investments in Southeast Asia. We probably will start make our first investment in Brazil very soon, not because we actively want to go there, but people in other developing countries with large domestic growing urbanizing economy are coming to us to look for our knowledge and experience with China and US. So they want to get both to help them to expand at a faster pace. And so the transformation that we're seeing in US and China could happen thanks to technology in other places. What worries me is the digital divide between, for example, Silicon Valley, New York, and the heartland America. And in China, you see some difference between East and West, part of our country as well. So how, as venture capitalists, we're mindful of that and can work with tech companies to bridge that gap is going to be increasingly important, because society's embrace of technology or pushing back against the ill effects of technology will determine how fast the society will evolve. And how to do that wisely is not an easy task.
Certainly isn't. I'd like to turn now to some questions from our audience and to get people in the room involved. One question is, I'd like to have you start with this one, Hans. What are you learning with your investments in China as China is now innovating in business models? How is your investments in China informing investments that are here in the United States?
Right. given our experience with Alibaba and Xiaomi in China, one learned how to build up an ecosystem to help sellers to improve their lives by making their transactions on Alibaba easier. And seeing Xiaomi building a product that's crowdsourced to build and design a product together with the consumers. We're investors in 3 of the top 5 shopping apps in the US. Number 1 is Amazon, number 2 is Wish, I'm on the board of. Number 3 is OfferUp, I'm an observer on. And then number 4 is Walmart, number 5 is Poshmark, I'm on the board of. And if I didn't have that mass market experience and working with sellers to make them lives better, I wouldn't have bet on these 3 companies. And when I bet on them, they were quite small, and I'll grow up to be this stage. And so in Silicon Valley or New York, in the top cities, people tend to invest based on what they know. And look at the people in this room, it probably represents top 1% of wealth and knowledge in the world. And if you only sell to people who you know, that's probably a 20 million, 30 million, maybe 50 million addressable market. The world has 3 billion internet users on smartphone. They are very different. How do you figure out, start a business that will benefit them to improve their lives is a much bigger issue. And so we invest in US and China, both with that kind of lens on. How do you build something that can affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people?
Carmen, this one is for you, I think. Let's pull the lens back, given your background in history and this interaction with politics and economy. This question is, how is the current political climate impacting cross-border investment with US and China, with tariffs, piracy issues, and others? And how is that going to affect the collaboration or competition with the US and China?
Well, I think that, I'm an optimist, so I feel in the long run, everything should work out. But I think we're going to...
Cautiously optimistic.
I'm very, very optimistic. But I think we're going to go through some very difficult times.
Yep.
And I think that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Mm-hmm. And I think that the areas of instability and that aside from, I would say that from on a very concrete level, the new rules that are coming out around tariffs, around investment, around technology transfer is so unclear at this point that I think it makes it hard sometimes for us to know what to do. And I also think that the immigration policy also is something that will, we're afraid, and I don't want it to be a deterrent to people coming here, because so I think that these are all things we have to work through. And I think that at least I think just about everybody right now is we're paying a lot of attention to what's happening in Washington and in Beijing to try to understand what is going to come down the pike so that we can adjust what we're doing to that. And if I take it back a bit, I would say that the level of the lack of trust between China and the US right now is the highest I've ever seen it. And I think that it's both misunderstanding and distrust. I think that both sides don't really know what the other side really wants. People could say, okay, this is what this side wants, but you could give it a different interpretation of what China is after, and you can give it different interpretations of what the US is after, depending on how you want to look at it, with very different outcomes in terms of your response. And I will close my remarks here by saying, in a way, when I am in China, I tell the Chinese, I think there's actually an underestimation in China of how deep the anti-China sentiment is in the US.
Yes.
I don't think China understands it.
Nope.
I keep telling them that. I think in the same way, I also don't, I think that the US also doesn't understand, I think, two things about China. I think one is that people in China are very patriotic and national.
Yeah.
In other words, if Xi Jinping is seen as like backing off or giving in, it would really affect, I think it would affect the government of China. So I think there's limits as to what China can do. But I also think another thing that the US doesn't quite understand is that China is a very diverse society. And there are many, many people in China with their own opinions as to what's going on. And I, for one, lived through the process of democratization in Taiwan. And people may not know this, but both the KMT and the CCP is based upon Marxism, Leninism, democratic centralist organizations. And you saw the transformation in Taiwan into a democratic society. And it happened within,
1 generation.
With 1 generation. Yeah. And I'm optimistic, and I hope that there will be a peaceful evolution towards a more, towards a more diverse society in China. So I'm an optimist.
Hans, do you want to weigh in, optimist or pessimist, and what misunderstandings would you like to help rectify tonight?
Mostly agree with what Carmen said. I think that what I don't want to see, I was at Recode in LA, and some of the sentiments there, one of the senators who spoke there was that we're at war with China, and we treat this as a war, and all that sort of Cold War lingo started to come out. And then if we get into that kind of mentality, then it's inevitable that conflict will happen. But at the end of the day, the two countries are intertwined enough that it would not be, it will be lose-lose for both sides. I think what China is doing is that it understands that U.S. accounts for 20% of its trade with the rest of the world. And China will figure out a way to lessen its dependence on trading with U.S. and do more with Southeast Asia and other regions. I think through the recent incident, China knows that it cannot depend on U.S. for chips. It will try to figure out how to design and manufacture chips itself. The more there's conflict, the more it will force China to become more self-sufficient. And it's not as positive. If the US is seen as having stronger technology and better companies that compete fairly and do well, there's a lot of respect for what US has accomplished in China. But if US start strong-arm China, then like Carmen said, there are a lot of people that would have been sympathizing to the US will become, they need to be more patriotic and protect themselves. So I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of the things this administration has done in terms of showing China that U.S. needs more, but it can be done a lot more constructively, a lot more smoothly. So we'll see, but I agree that it will be rockier times ahead before both figure out how to coexist with each other.
Can I add one more thing?
One more thing,
I just want to add that, China is a planned economy, so they have industrial policy, and the US does not have industrial policy. And because of that, I think that a lot of things that happened in the last 20 years have been difficult for the US.
To understand, yeah.
And I think that, and so I think that for the US, like Hans said, for the US to really pay attention to what can be done to help U.S. companies and to ensure that certain industries remain in the U.S.
Yeah.
Including like when I can understand why the sale of Qualcomm was stopped. And so I think that there are things that needs to be done, but I think that, as Hans said, it has to be done in a very sophisticated, thoughtful way with a scalpel, and to really, really think about what we're doing, and to understand the ecosystem. And when Trump when the president announced that he wants to nationalize the 5G industry. I don't even think, I'm not sure if that's doable. I mean, I don't even know if our Constitution would allow that. But the issue here is that the world there's been so much globalization and interweaving of the supply chains around the world that which I think for the US to try to go in and try to create a better situation for the US, I think that's fine. I think that, I just think it needs to be done in a really thoughtful way and careful way.
If and when US has a coherent industrial policy that actually is well thought out, takes time to build, and has a vision that makes sense, I think China and the rest of the world will have tremendous respect for the United States. We'll see which administration can do that.
Did you say if and when? And on audience questions, there's a cluster around what's next, around can BAT compete against FANG, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, against Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, or what's happening as China might be leaping ahead in blockchain and AI. Thoughts on what's going to be ahead in competition or collaboration? One thought from you, Hans. One from you, Carmen.
I think on the topic of blockchain, China is against ICO, but encouraging blockchain to take place because it does solve a lot of cross-border issues. And Alibaba spends time on that, Tencent spends time on that, Baidu spends time on that. I think the Chinese companies are definitely doing faster than most American companies. I still think that the Google and Facebook and the Amazon of the world, the leading US companies are doing a lot and they're well ahead. But in China, you see a broader base of participation by companies willing to work harder and spending more time and putting more resources behind it. I don't view this as a race, but I strongly encourage and hope more US startups are serious about doing more. If you go to San Francisco, you go to most of the companies after 8 o'clock at night, there's no one there because people are going to be at happy hour. That's why they live in the city. It's all good. But I go to China, again, if I need to visit the Beijing of Xiaomi, I probably get pushed back to midnight and 1 o'clock. And when I'm there, 70–80% of people are still there. And there are people waiting to talk to me in front of me. So in the US, we kind of poo-poo and dismiss, you work so hard, you must not be very efficient. Well, if the other guy is as smart as you are, went to the same schools as you did, but she's working twice as much time, and they've been doing that for years, and the results are showing in the market cap and revenue growth, and those companies expanding beyond China. Maybe there's an alternative way to make this work, and maybe you should be more open-minded. China is not Japan. China is not South Korea. It's much, much, much bigger. And the drive we see in Chinese entrepreneurs is across the board. It's not anything the Communist Party is preaching to them. It's naturally driven because they see what it means to be successful. They see other people who have made it. And all the young entrepreneurs I talk to who are running their next generation of internet startups in China in their mid-30s, they grew up in an environment in China where China had Olympics in 2008. They grew up in China extremely proud. They may not completely agree with Communist parties every move, but they definitely want to show that they're on an equal basis as everyone else. So they will be expanding beyond China. And I think most Americans need to learn how to speak, and especially in tech, need to learn how to speak Chinese. If you can read what's going on over there, and just read what's in the New York Times and Washington Post, find papers, find publications, but you're not getting the full picture. And so not knowing what's going on is going to be a biggest challenge for US to get better.
As we close tonight, we have young entrepreneurs here in the audience, and I'd like to ask each of you for a word of advice. You've worked with phenomenal entrepreneurs. I asked each of you earlier tonight to think what is one word of advice and a short story that would explain why you chose that word. Carmen?
Well, I chose belief because I feel that the most important thing is to follow what you believe and what you want to do and to be yourself. And I think that that's the most important thing. And I think that to be true to yourself, to do what you think is right, and but being considerate of other people too, of course, but to recognize that at the end of the day, your values and what you believe is what is going to define you. And at the end of the day, that's very important, the most important thing.
Thank you. Hans.
The first word that came to mind was dream, because you got to have a vision, have a dream of what you want to do in order to know what you want to do. But the more I thought about it, I thought grit is a better term, because it's easy to have a dream. It's easy to have a vision. It's easy to want to do something different. But the amount of energy and commitment and recruiting people to do this with you takes 10 plus years to get there. I invested in Xiaomi in 2010. Back then, with just 3 people and a crazy idea, the valuation was somewhere between 20 and 25 million. It was considered the most expensive startup in China. And when we doubled down 8 months later, $150 million valuation, I remember one partner told me, Google, when they raised money, when they already had a product, it was a $70 million valuation. This company is twice as expensive as Google. Basically, the underlying message is, what the hell are you doing? But the teams that I saw in China and some of the teams that I saw in the US, the reason they can make it is really because the team, especially the founder, has grit. And to have the drive and energy to persist, to constantly think about how to improve yourself, how to figure out how to learn things quicker, faster. The kind of growth we saw in Chen Wei at Didi, or Danny Zhang at Wish, or even the next generation of leaders in Xiaomi, the 4, 5, 6, 8 years I see them grow is tremendous growth. And they were much younger and less experienced. But in the 4, 5 to 8 years that we work with them, we saw them just become very different people. And when you investing early, nothing is more satisfying than seeing the young kids you invest in ends up becoming titans of the industry. There's nothing to me that was more satisfying than that. And when that happens, you feel like you're making a positive contribution to society. So I get thrilled from doing this. Even though I'm 48 this year, I love doing this every single day.
Thank
and
you.
I feel very lucky to be able to do that.
Well, we've been lucky to have both of you here, Carmen and Hans. You've been not only at the forefront of people that have been understanding, but also leading the change in China in both venture and tech. Tonight, you've shared your journeys, personal and also the evolution of entrepreneurs and tech over these different waves over time. And for that, we want to thank both of you on behalf of the Computer History Museum and tonight's audience. Thank you so much.